Everything. Growth rarely begins with thunder. It begins quietly, with a decision, a small habit, a single shift in direction. Yet that small decision holds a secret momentum. Everything. Every positive choice compounds, expanding who you become, shaping what you create, and transforming how you show up in life. Everything. Personal growth isn't a sudden explosion. It's a snowball rolling down a mountain, gaining mass, speed, and unstoppable power. And by the time it reaches the valley, everything. What started small becomes extraordinary. This audiobook is about learning to start that snowball and then never letting it stop. There are moments in life when everything seems too big, everything, too far away and almost impossible to change. We look at the life we want or the version of ourselves we dream of becoming, everything, and we feel a sort of quiet heaviness, almost as if the distance between where we are and where we want to be is an entire lifetime wide. And yet, everything. If you look closely at every transformation story, every person who became something extraordinary, you'll notice that their journey didn't begin with a dramatic leap or a groundbreaking moment. Everything. It began with something small, something almost invisible, a choice most people would overlook. What I've discovered, and what I want you to feel deeply inside yourself, everything, is that the smallest shift today can become the greatest transformation tomorrow. A tiny decision, repeated often enough, becomes a habit, everything. And that habit becomes the foundation of a new identity. The human mind loves instant results, but growth rarely operates that way. Instead, it unfolds gradually, everything. Accumulating strength just like a snowball forming at the peak of a mountain, tiny at first but impossible to ignore once momentum takes over, everything. It's tempting to think that change only matters when it's dramatic, the intense workout, the sudden discipline, the big life overhaul. But very often, everything, those intense changes fade as quickly as they appeared. Real transformation happens quietly. It begins with choosing water instead of soda. Everything, reading 10 pages instead of scrolling through social media, waking up 10 minutes earlier, or deciding not to quit even when progress feels slow. Everything. You might say those things are too small to matter, but small doesn't mean insignificant. Small means repeatable. Small means doable. Small means sustainable. Everything. Think about someone who decides to walk for 10 minutes a day. 10 minutes won't transform their health overnight. It won't create a dramatic physical result. Everything. But something unexpected happens when they show up again the next day and the day after that. Those 10 minutes eventually become 15, then 20. Then a new belief forms. Everything. I am a person who takes care of my health. It sounds subtle, but identity grows through repetition, not intensity. Everything. And once someone believes they are the kind of person who values health, everything else begins to shift naturally, from their energy to their confidence to their long-term habits. Everything. One of the most powerful examples I ever witnessed was a man who decided to save just $1 a day, not 50, not 100, just one. Everything. He didn't do it because the amount was impressive. He did it because he wanted to prove to himself that he could commit to something. $1 felt almost embarrassingly small. Everything. But in that tiny decision there was a pattern forming, a pattern of mindfulness, discipline, and delayed gratification. Over 2 years, that single dollar became hundreds, then thousands. Everything. But the real transformation wasn't in the money. The transformation was that he began to see himself as someone capable of saving, planning, and building towards something meaningful. Everything. What changed his life wasn't the dollar. It was the identity that slowly formed behind it. This is how real change works. Small choices create a different version of you, everything, and that version of you makes different choices. When people say, "I don't know where to start," they usually think they need a massive plan. But the truth is, everything. The starting point is almost always much smaller than they imagine. When you take even the smallest step, you activate movement. And once movement begins, momentum starts to build. Everything. Imagine standing at the foot of a staircase looking up toward the top. It may be 100 steps. It might represent your dream career, your ideal health, your spiritual growth, everything. Or the person you want to be emotionally. If you stare only at the top, you'll feel overwhelmed. You might even convince yourself you'll never get there, everything. But if you shift your focus to only the next step, the one directly in front of you, suddenly the journey becomes possible. Not easy, but possible, everything. And that feeling of possibility is what keeps momentum alive. Think for a moment about a time in your life when something small eventually led to something great, everything. Maybe it was a skill you learned when you were younger, a musical instrument, a sport, or speaking with confidence. You didn't master it in a week. You practiced. You stumbled. Everything. You improved one tiny fraction at a time. Those tiny improvements compounded, and eventually they became ability. We often forget how many things in life we learned this way. Everything. Yet, when it comes to adult goals, we expect instant mastery. We forget that every skill we now possess began with a single small attempt. I want you to reflect on your own life as I say this. Everything. Ask yourself, what small decision could I make today that would point me in the direction I want to go? Not something extreme or unrealistic. Something simple. Something obvious. Everything. Something you can repeat daily. That's the seed of transformation. The decision you can revisit every day without feeling overwhelmed. Everything. You don't need to transform your whole life this week. You just need to commit to one meaningful action that aligns with who you want to become. Everything. There's something deeply hopeful about that realization. Greatness doesn't require perfection. It requires intention. Everything. It requires choosing a direction and taking steps toward it repeatedly. Think about the people you admire, the disciplined, the successful, the wise. They didn't start there. Everything. They didn't wake up one day suddenly capable. They started with decisions that felt small, decisions they could sustain. Over time, those decisions compounded into confidence. Everything. And confidence becomes one of the most powerful forces in human growth. Once you prove to yourself that you can follow through on a small promise, everything, you begin to trust yourself with bigger ones. Everything. So many people underestimate their own potential because they judge themselves by the size of their current effort instead of the direction of their current effort. Everything. They look at the tiny behaviors and think, this isn't enough. But enough isn't the goal. Consistency is. Everything. The compound effect of consistency outperforms the short-term intensity of big efforts that don't last. Imagine a small stream of water slowly carving a path through rock. Everything. One drop at a time, it creates depth where there was once only hardness. That's what your small decisions do. Every day they carve away at doubt, laziness, fear, and old identity. Everything. And one day, you look back and realize how far you've come. Not because you made a huge leap, but because you refused to stop moving forward. Everything. There will be days when you feel you're not growing fast enough. Days when the results are invisible. Days when you question whether your effort matters at all. When those moments come, everything. I want you to remember that the snowball is forming, even if you can't see it yet. Every habit begins quietly. Every identity shift happens internally before anything changes outwardly. Everything. You are building roots below the surface long before you see branches in the sunlight. Everything. Some of the most powerful transformations happen during the periods when nobody else notices anything at all. But eventually, everything. The results become impossible to ignore, not because of one big decision, but because of hundreds of tiny ones you made again and again. So today, choose something small. Everything. Something that feels manageable. Something you can repeat tomorrow. Let that be the quiet beginning of something undeniable. Everything. The most extraordinary journeys in human history began with one small step, one quiet decision, one moment of courage that didn't feel like courage at the time. Everything. If you can believe that the smallest choice can move you closer to the person you want to be, then transformation stops feeling impossible. It begins to feel inevitable. Momentum. Everything. It's a deceptively simple word, yet inside it lies one of the greatest forces of personal transformation. When we think about breakthroughs, everything, we tend to imagine dramatic changes, giant leaps, massive victories, sudden success. But if you look closely at how real progress happens, it rarely arrives as a sudden event. Instead, everything, it unfolds like the slow turning of a wheel that gradually spins faster until you can no longer stop it. Momentum is born from consistency, not intensity. Everything. It's the result of doing a small thing long enough that it becomes powerful. Everything. Most people never discover this truth because they spend their whole lives waiting for the perfect moment to make a big move. Everything. Never realizing that tiny moves repeated are infinitely more powerful than one grand burst of effort. I used to believe that to create a breakthrough, I had to make a dramatic change. Everything. I thought success looked like locking myself away for 48 hours of nonstop work or changing my entire lifestyle in a single weekend. I'd buy new planners, set ambitious schedules, everything, feel motivated for a short while, then eventually burn out and slip back into old patterns. It felt like pushing a car stuck in mud. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't move forward. Everything. But the problem was never my lack of motivation or discipline. The real issue was that I was trying to create momentum through intensity. Everything. What I didn't realize was that momentum builds most powerfully through repetition, through small, consistent actions that are so simple you almost overlook their importance. Everything. You don't need explosive effort. You need sustained effort, gently pushing forward day after day. Think about a person who decides to run for the first time. On day one, everything, they push themselves so hard that they can barely breathe, feeling victorious for surviving such a brutal workout. But the next day, everything hurts. The motivation disappears, everything. They say they'll run again tomorrow, and tomorrow becomes next week, and eventually, the idea fades. But imagine instead they had jogged slowly for 10 minutes, everything, stopped while they still felt good, and then returned the next day for another easy run. Over time, running would become a natural part of their life. Without realizing it, everything, their body would adapt, their confidence would grow, and one day they would look in the mirror and say, "I don't just run. I'm a runner." Everything. That shift in identity only happens through consistency. Intensity may give you a good story, but consistency gives you results. Everything. You've probably seen this in your own life. Maybe you worked on a project with enormous energy at the beginning, only to find that the initial passion eventually faded. Everything. You might have even been disappointed in yourself, wondering why you couldn't sustain that same fire. But the truth is, nobody sustains intensity forever. Everything. Even the most successful people in the world don't rely on it. What they rely on is rhythm. Momentum is rhythm. It's waking up and doing a little bit of what matters. Everything. Even on the days when you don't feel like it. It's choosing progress over perfection. It's focusing on what you can repeat, not what you can conquer in one dramatic moment. Everything. Once you understand this, you stop waiting for motivation and start building momentum. There is something beautiful that happens when you commit to small actions daily. Everything. Every day becomes proof of your capability. Every repetition becomes a message to your subconscious mind, a reminder that you are someone who shows up. Everything. You start believing in the future you're building, not because you accomplished something huge today, but because you're accumulating wins. Everything. That accumulation becomes a quiet form of confidence. It's not loud or dramatic, but it's the kind of confidence that sticks. And slowly, quietly, your life begins to accelerate. Everything. Think about a snowball rolling down a snowy hill. At first, it moves slowly. It doesn't look like much. But as it keeps rolling, it picks up more snow, gathering size and weight. Everything. And soon it becomes unstoppable. That's momentum. It doesn't start big. It becomes big. And the key to becoming unstoppable is simply to keep rolling. Everything. You may not see the results immediately, but results are never immediate. Even the great breakthroughs in science, business, or human achievement were rarely sudden. Everything. They were the culmination of consistent effort that finally reached a tipping point. History doesn't record the small steps, but the small steps were always the cause of the breakthrough. Everything. One of the most effective ways to build momentum is to lower the barrier of entry. If you want to read more, don't set a goal of reading for 1 hour a day. Everything. Commit to reading just 2 pages. If you want to improve your health, don't force yourself into an extreme diet. Begin with adding a single healthy food each day. Everything. If you want to build a business, don't pressure yourself to create something massive immediately. Just make one small improvement daily. Everything. People underestimate the power of these micro actions because they look insignificant in the moment. But significance is not measured in moments, it's measured in accumulation. Everything. The small things you repeat shape the big things you become. If you've ever wondered why some people seem to move forward effortlessly while others constantly restart everything, the answer often lies in how momentum was built. The person who moves forward naturally isn't more talented, they're more consistent. Everything. They've built enough momentum that the process now helps push them instead of them having to push the process. Imagine a cyclist pedaling up a hill. At first, every push is difficult. Everything. But eventually, the slope evens out, the wheels spin faster, and the slightest pedal sends the bike moving forward effortlessly. That's what happens when momentum begins to support you. Everything. You're no longer forcing yourself, you're being carried by what you've built. There's a moment that often arrives when consistency starts to feel like identity. Everything. You'll notice yourself saying things like, "I'm someone who works out. I'm someone who reads every day. I'm someone who follows through." Everything. That identity shift is priceless because identity is stronger than motivation. Motivation is emotional, but identity is structural. It becomes the foundation of how you live. Everything. Once your sense of self shifts, your behaviors become automatic. You stop needing discipline because your actions are simply who you are. And once an action becomes identity, everything. Momentum multiplies exponentially. If you're listening to this and thinking you need to overhaul your entire life, I want you to pause. You don't need an overhaul, everything. You need a tiny shift that you repeat long enough to matter. Start embarrassingly small. Start so small that your mind can't talk you out of it, everything. The human brain resists big changes because it feels threatened by them, but it accepts small changes easily. This isn't weakness, it's biology, everything. And when biology works with you instead of against you, momentum begins to support your growth instead of defending your limitations. There will be days when you don't feel like continuing, everything. And that's exactly when consistency matters most. The point isn't to be perfect, the point is to never stop entirely, everything. Doing one push-up on a lazy day is more powerful than doing 20 when you're motivated, everything. Reading one page on a busy night is more valuable than reading a whole book in a burst once a month. Not because the action itself matters, but because it protects your momentum, everything. Once momentum is protected, progress is inevitable. You might be surprised by how quickly your life begins to shift once consistency becomes your focus. Your confidence strengthens, everything. Your results compound, and your possibilities expand. You begin to see opportunities you never noticed before because momentum sharpens your awareness. Everything. The future starts looking exciting instead of overwhelming, and life begins to feel like it's moving with you rather than against you. That feeling, that acceleration, everything, is the beginning of every great breakthrough. There comes a moment in every journey of growth when the change is no longer just something you're doing, but something you're becoming. Everything. It begins quietly. You might not even notice it at first. You wake up one morning and the thing that once felt difficult, forced, or unfamiliar somehow feels more natural. Everything. The actions that once required discipline begin to feel like a part of you. And that is the subtle, powerful point where growth becomes identity. Everything. Because habits don't simply change outcomes. Habits rewrite the story you believe about who you are. Every meaningful transformation begins with action. Everything. But it isn't finished until those actions have reshaped the way you see yourself. Someone who exercises every day eventually stops thinking, everything, I'm trying to be healthy, and starts believing, I am someone who takes care of my body. The shift happens internally, everything. Someone who reads every day stops trying to improve and starts feeling like a person who values learning, growth, and curiosity. The identity forms quietly, but once it forms, everything else becomes easier. Because your mind naturally protects what it believes is true about you. We often underestimate how powerful identity is. Everything. You behave in alignment with who you believe you are, even if that belief is outdated or inaccurate. If someone believes, consciously or unconsciously, everything, I'm always late, they act accordingly. They don't rush because lateness feels familiar. If someone believes, everything, I'm bad with money, they subconsciously reinforce that belief by avoiding financial responsibility. If someone believes everything, I'm the kind of person who never finishes things, they will find a way to quit, even if they don't consciously want to. This is not laziness, everything. It is identity trying to stay consistent with its own definition. Growth, however, allows you to challenge and rewrite those definitions. Everything. Think of someone who begins going for a short walk every morning. At first, it doesn't feel like much. It might feel awkward, inconsistent, or easily interrupted. But after a few weeks, everything. When they wake up, something begins to feel off if they don't walk. That's identity forming. The action becomes congruent with who they are becoming. Everything. They are no longer forcing themselves to be someone else. They are simply acting like the version they now believe they are. Real transformation never happens only on the surface. Everything. You can choose new behaviors temporarily, but unless those behaviors settle into your identity, unless you begin to think of yourself differently, old patterns will eventually return. Everything. This is why so many people make temporary progress and then slide backward. They changed habits for a short period, but they didn't shift the inner story. The outside changed, everything, but the inside resisted because the inner identity still claimed the past. The most powerful growth is the kind that starts outside but finishes within. Everything. Imagine someone who always believed they weren't good at relationships. Maybe they grew up feeling like their voice didn't matter or their emotions weren't important. Everything. They enter adulthood expecting rejection, expecting disappointment, expecting to be misunderstood. Even if they meet people who are kind and supportive, everything, they might misinterpret kindness because their identity still assumes abandonment. But as they learn communication, emotional awareness, and healthy boundaries, everything, something subtle begins to change. They start feeling heard. They start recognizing their own needs. Slowly, their identity shifts, and suddenly relationships feel possible. Everything. Not because others changed, but because they did. This is the moment where personal growth becomes more than behavior change. It becomes a rebirth of who you believe you are allowed to be. Everything. And that changes everything. Often, the first signs of identity growth appear as discomfort. When you begin to shift into a new version of yourself, you might feel uncertain. Everything. It's unfamiliar territory. You might even question your progress. You might wonder if you're pretending, if you're just temporarily motivated. Everything. Or if people will notice you're changing. That discomfort is not a sign of failure. It's a sign your identity is evolving. Anything unfamiliar feels awkward before it feels authentic. Everything. Remember learning to ride a bicycle. The early attempts feel uncomfortable, unbalanced, unnatural. But once you learn it, the feeling of confidence becomes part of you. Everything. Growth works the same way. To truly transform identity, repetition matters more than intensity. You don't become someone different because you do something amazing once. Everything. You become someone different because you repeat something simple 100 times. A journal entry once a month won't make you a reflective person. Everything. But 5 minutes a day for 3 months might. A strict diet for a week won't make you a healthy person. Everything. But small, consistent choices might turn you into someone who naturally takes care of their body. Habits don't need to be dramatic. They need to be consistent. Everything. Because consistency is what convinces the brain that this is now who you are. One of the most powerful things you can say to yourself is this: everything. I'm becoming someone who. It doesn't matter if you're not fully there yet. When you begin defining your growth in identity-based language, everything, your brain starts aligning with that direction. Everything. I'm becoming someone who manages money wisely. I'm becoming someone who finishes what I start. I'm becoming someone who keeps their promises to themselves. The moment you say it, everything, even quietly, you shift from effort to becoming. And in that shift, the resistance begins to fade. Think of identity like the soil in a garden. Habits are seeds. If the soil rejects the seed, everything, nothing grows. But if the soil accepts the seed, growth becomes natural. When you repeat a habit, you are watering a seed. Over time, the soil changes. Everything. It becomes fertile for new beliefs to grow. Eventually, your mind stops resisting the new behavior because the identity now welcomes what once felt impossible. Everything. You've probably experienced moments when old behaviors suddenly felt unfamiliar, even strange. Maybe you used to procrastinate often. Everything. And one day you realize you don't delay things anymore. The habit didn't just change. Your identity changed. You now see yourself as someone who takes action, someone who values time. Everything. Someone who follows through. That inner shift makes future habits easier because you're no longer fighting yourself. Identity growth also means letting go of old versions of yourself. Everything. Sometimes growth isn't about adding new habits, but releasing old narratives. You might have believed things about yourself that were never actually true. Everything. Maybe you grew up thinking you were shy, when in reality you were just cautious. Maybe you believed you weren't smart, when really you just learned differently. Everything. Maybe you believed you weren't motivated, when in truth you simply didn't have clarity. Everything. Growth gives you permission to release outdated beliefs and step into a more accurate version of yourself. The real question isn't simply, everything. What do I want to do? The deeper question is, who do I want to become? Because once identity rises to meet your habits, actions follow naturally. Everything. There's no longer a constant internal debate. There's no exhausting negotiation between the old you and the new you. The path feels aligned. Everything. Growth becomes less of a struggle and more of a natural expression of who you are now. It's important to understand that identity-based growth doesn't require perfection. In fact, everything. Perfection has almost nothing to do with it. Even when you slip, even when you fall short, even when you take a step backward, your identity remains intact once it's formed. Everything. Someone who reads daily but misses a day still sees themselves as a reader. Someone who exercises 4 times a week but skips a workout doesn't suddenly think they're unhealthy. Everything. Identity holds you steady even when habits temporarily fluctuate. That's the advantage of becoming instead of merely doing. And as identity deepens, something beautiful starts happening. Everything. the world responds differently. Opportunities open. People treat you according to who you've become, and most importantly, you start treating yourself with the respect, intention, everything, and belief that matches your new identity. When growth becomes part of you, the future stops feeling intimidating. It begins to feel inevitable, everything. Like the natural next chapter in the person you were always meant to become. There are moments in life that arrive without warning, like the sudden dip in a winding mountain road. Everything. You're driving forward, making progress, finally feeling momentum, and then without notice something forces you to slow down, adjust, or even stop entirely. Everything. We usually interpret those moments as failures or obstacles, as if life is trying to block our path. Everything. But what if those setbacks are actually part of the acceleration we're meant to experience? What if the slowdown today is the exact force that pushes us further tomorrow? Everything. When we begin to understand this, something shifts inside us. We stop fearing setbacks and instead start using them. I've seen people who never had everything figured out, everything, who stumbled repeatedly, but somehow ended up further ahead than the ones who rarely struggled. And the reason is surprisingly simple. Everything. Every setback taught them something that progress alone never could. Growth was never meant to be a straight line. It isn't a staircase that takes you upward step by step. Everything. It's more like climbing a hill made of sand. Sometimes you take a step up and slide halfway back down. Sometimes you get tired and rest. Everything. Sometimes the wind blows sand in your eyes and you question why you're climbing at all. But if you keep moving, every challenging moment strengthens your legs, your lungs, your discipline, everything, your patience, and your courage. We tend to believe that struggle is a sign something is wrong with us. We believe successful people avoided failure, everything, when the truth is that success was carved out of failure. Think about every story you've ever admired. The hero doesn't grow during the easy part of the journey, everything. Growth comes from the moments that challenge them, frighten them, or force them to face themselves. When life becomes difficult, that is when we are invited to expand. When setbacks show up, most people react emotionally first. Frustration, disappointment, even anger. It's natural. But if we pause long enough to listen to the moment, everything. There is always a valuable question hidden inside. What is life trying to teach me right now? Sometimes the answer is patience. Sometimes resilience. Sometimes a new strategy. Everything, sometimes humility. And often a deeper understanding of ourselves and what truly matters. Everything. There was a young entrepreneur I once spoke to who tried starting a business twice and failed both times. He told me he felt embarrassed even thinking about a third attempt. Everything. I asked him what he learned from the first two. He spoke for nearly an hour. He had learned everything about pricing, about building trust with clients, everything, about planning quarterly instead of monthly, about preparing financially before launching something new. At the end, I simply asked, everything. Do you realize how much knowledge you just gained by failing? He sat quietly for a moment before saying, everything. I guess I've been treating the failure as a wall instead of a classroom. The next year, his third attempt became the breakthrough he had dreamed about. Not because it was easy, everything, but because he knew exactly what to avoid. Those setbacks didn't just teach him, they prepared him. Think about an archer pulling back a bowstring. To launch the arrow forward, everything, you first have to pull it back. The resistance isn't the opposite of progress. It's part of the mechanism, everything. The setback becomes the force that drives the arrow further than it could have gone without that pull. In life, when something pulls you backward, it doesn't always mean retreat, everything. Sometimes it means you're being prepared for a launch you can't yet see. But of course, in real life, the emotional weight can feel heavy. When something falls apart, when a plan fails, everything. When someone disappoints us or when we disappoint ourselves, it's easy to internalize the experience as defeat. It's easy to believe that this moment defines us, everything. But setbacks only define you if you let them decide who you become next. If instead you say to yourself, everything, this moment teaches me something powerful. The meaning of the setback changes instantly. It becomes part of your evolution. Imagine someone training for a marathon, everything. They begin running every day, feeling proud of their progress. Then suddenly one morning, they twist their ankle. The doctor tells them to rest for weeks. Their routine breaks. Everything. Their motivation drops. They feel like everything they built was wasted. But during those weeks, they learn something crucial. They learn to train smarter, to warm up properly, everything, to listen to their body, and to strengthen muscles they had ignored. And once they heal, They're not only ready to continue, they're stronger and less likely to get injured again. Everything. That injury prevented a much bigger setback later. That slowdown was actually acceleration disguised as pause. There's also something deeply human about setbacks. They humble us. Everything. They keep us connected to others. When everything is perfect, we sometimes drift into arrogance, but when life challenges us, we rediscover empathy and gratitude. Everything. We remember what struggle feels like, and it makes us more compassionate and more understanding. That emotional depth becomes part of our strength. Everything. It shapes our character more than success ever will. There's a mistake people make when they face hard times. They assume the setback is permanent. They believe this moment is forever. Everything. But every storm eventually becomes part of yesterday's sky. Every difficulty eventually becomes something you look back on instead of something you are stuck inside. Everything. When we're in the middle of a challenge, it feels endless because our emotions magnify the moment. But if we picture ourselves months or years ahead, everything, we begin to notice how temporary every challenge is, and the moment we deeply believe that fear loses its grip on us. That belief gives power back to our hands. Everything. If you ever meet someone who achieved something impressive, ask them about their hardest moment. You'll see something interesting. They speak about that moment with pride. Everything, almost as if it was necessary. They'll say things like, "If that didn't happen, everything, I wouldn't be who I am today." Or, "That failure became my turning point." People don't usually remember the easy moments with the same passion. They remember the ones that changed them. Everything. And transformation nearly always requires discomfort. Actionable growth actually begins inside the questions we ask ourselves during struggle. Instead of saying, "Everything, why is this happening to me?" try saying, "What is this trying to prepare me for?" Instead of saying, "I guess I failed," try saying, "Everything, I just learned something valuable." Instead of saying, "I lost," tell yourself, "I'm being redirected." The words we use during tough moments determine how quickly we recover. Everything. The story we tell ourselves creates our emotional reality. When setbacks occur, it helps to zoom out mentally rather than zoom in. Zooming in makes the problem look massive, overwhelming, everything, and urgent. Zooming out reminds us that this is merely one chapter, not the entire book. Sometimes the chapter that feels painful today becomes the chapter that readers love the most later. Everything. Our future self often looks back with gratitude for experiences we once dreaded. We don't see it now, but eventually we do. Everything. There's a quiet truth about growth that no one teaches you in school. Progress is rarely visible while it's happening. It looks like confusion, discomfort, and uncertainty. Everything. It looks like trying something and failing. It looks like repeating the same effort again and again, not knowing when the breakthrough will come. But underneath the surface, everything. Your resilience is becoming thicker, your mindset sharper, your habits stronger, and your capacity deeper. The surface looks still, but the transformation beneath is massive. Everything. So when you face a setback, remind yourself that this isn't a detour away from success. It's part of the journey toward it. Every storm reshapes you. Every loss redirects you. Everything. Every failure teaches you. Every challenge strengthens something you'll need later. If the road were always smooth, you would never learn how to steer. Everything. But because the road bends and twists, you gain skills that make you unstoppable. There will always be moments that shake your confidence, moments that test your patience. Everything. Moments that interrupt your plans. But those moments are not there to defeat you. They are there to expand you. And if you let them, they will. Everything. There comes a remarkable moment in a person's journey when growth no longer feels like something they're trying to force. It begins feeling natural, almost effortless. Everything. And surprisingly aligned with who they believe themselves to be. At that point, you're not just changing your habits anymore. You're changing the foundation of your identity. Everything. And once identity shifts, your possibilities begin expanding almost without limit. Think for a moment about someone who goes to the gym consistently. Everything. Not because they're obsessed with discipline, but because being healthy has become part of who they are. Think about someone who saves money automatically. Everything. Not because they're afraid of running out, but because being financially responsible has become part of their identity. These are not actions anymore. Everything. These are new versions of a person's self-concept, and once that shift takes place, growth becomes automatic in ways most people underestimate. In the beginning of personal development, everything, there is effort, resistance, self-doubt, and fear. Every action feels like pushing a boulder uphill. But as days turn into weeks and weeks turn into habits, everything, the boulder begins rolling on its own. That is the beautiful turning point, the moment when life stops being something you react to and becomes something you shape consciously. Everything. You start choosing your thoughts, choosing your actions, and choosing your path. You realize you're not simply living a life. You're directing it. Everything. That realization alone has the power to completely transform the future. Most people underestimate what identity does. They believe success is about working harder or knowing more. Everything. But the truth is, the most sustainable form of success comes from who you believe you are. A person who believes they're unworthy sabotages opportunities even when they arrive. Everything. A person who believes they're capable finds opportunity almost anywhere. Not because the world is different, but because their inner vision is. As you expand your personal growth, everything, your inner vision begins to change dramatically. What once felt impossible begins to feel achievable. What once felt scary begins to feel exciting. Everything. And what once felt out of reach begins to feel like a natural next step. Imagine a future version of yourself 5 years from now. Not one shaped by fear or hesitation. Everything. But one shaped by clarity. Picture yourself making decisions based on who you want to become rather than who you've been. Picture yourself acting courageously, consistently, everything, and intentionally. That version of you already exists in potential. Growth is simply the work of turning that potential into something real. It doesn't happen in one giant moment. Everything. It happens through consistent movement, small steps in the direction of a vision only you can see. Other people may not recognize that vision yet. Everything. They may not understand why you're investing in yourself, or learning new skills, or changing your environment. But they don't have to understand it. What matters is that you feel it. Everything, that inner shift, growing stronger with every step. There's something magical about momentum. It expands. The more you grow, the more growth becomes available to you. Everything. When you learn one skill, it unlocks the ability to learn another. When you overcome one fear, it strengthens your belief that you can overcome the next. Everything. When you take responsibility for one part of your life, you naturally begin taking responsibility for the rest. It's a compounding effect, a snowball gathering speed. And as it rolls, everything. You begin to recognize that your potential was never fixed. It was simply waiting for permission to expand. Think back to a time in your life when you thought you couldn't do something. Everything. But eventually, you did. Maybe it was getting that job, completing that project, learning something new, or having the courage to walk away from something unhealthy. Everything. Do you remember the version of you that doubted yourself? That version didn't know what the future version of you would accomplish. Growth made that possible. Everything. Now consider what future possibilities you might still be underestimating. There are doors waiting to open for you that you don't even know exist yet. Everything. There are people you haven't met who will help you grow in directions you can't yet imagine. Everything. There are opportunities that will only appear because you're becoming someone who's ready to receive them. Everything. Personal growth builds a future that keeps expanding because it keeps changing what you believe about yourself. Once growth becomes automatic, everything. You naturally seek challenges instead of avoiding them. You seek solutions instead of focusing on problems. You seek improvement rather than perfection. Everything. The world begins to look less like a barrier and more like a canvas. And that mindset changes everything. If you pay attention to successful people across any area of life, everything, you'll notice something: they didn't all start confident. Many of them began uncertain, afraid, and unsure, yet they moved anyway. Everything. They made choices that felt small in the moment but monumental in their long-term consequence. They didn't know exactly where their decisions would lead. Everything. But they trusted that movement matters more than certainty. Growth has a way of honoring those who keep going. When you commit, even imperfectly, everything, life begins responding with opportunities you never saw coming. And yet, there will always be moments of uncertainty. The future will never feel fully predictable. Everything. And growth will never feel perfectly smooth. But the difference now is simple: you no longer stop when things get hard. Everything. You no longer question your capability just because you face resistance. You don't collapse under pressure because you've learned how to rise from it. Everything. That inner resilience becomes your greatest advantage. It becomes evidence that you've grown beyond the version of yourself who once doubted everything. Everything. You've become someone who knows how to keep moving, even when the path isn't clear. People often wait for proof before they believe in themselves. But growth doesn't work that way. Everything. Belief comes from choosing, not from waiting. If you wait for perfect certainty, you'll always feel unprepared. But when you choose growth even while feeling uncertain, everything, you train your mind to expand courageously. That's the moment growth becomes automatic, not because you no longer face doubt, but because doubt no longer stops you. Everything. When your default response becomes action instead of hesitation, your future expands rapidly. There's a subtle shift that happens. You stop hoping things will change, everything, and you start trusting that they will because you're actively shaping them. You realize that growth doesn't guarantee a perfect life. It guarantees a meaningful one. Everything. Every challenge becomes a lesson. Every setback becomes a stepping stone. Every experience becomes part of your evolution. And the beautiful thing is, there is no endpoint. Everything. Growth doesn't finish. It continues unfolding, offering new horizons for as long as you're willing to keep walking. Everything. Think of your future not as a destination, but as an ever-expanding journey. With each year, with each choice, with each commitment to progress, you become more capable, more confident, everything, and more connected to your potential. As that happens, life reveals new levels of possibility. New dreams begin forming in the space where old fears once lived. Everything. You begin imagining a larger life than the one you ever dared to picture before. And that vision pulls you forward with a force that feels almost inevitable. Everything. You are building a future that is becoming unstoppable, not because life magically becomes easy, but because you are becoming someone powerful enough to navigate whatever comes. Everything. The most exciting part is this: everything you've learned so far is only the beginning. Your best days aren't behind you. They're being built right now, moment by moment. Everything, habit by habit, choice by choice. Growth doesn't just change what you do. It changes who you are becoming, and who you are becoming changes everything about where you're going next.